Mr. Tipton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for taking the time to be here. Want to be able to visit with you. Actually, I will go off of my colleague's comment to where you just made the comment that you are not convinced that regulatory changes are a key driver in terms of some of the challenges that we're having. And I'd like to go back to when we visited last year. We were talking about small banks and the impacts that they are feeling because of the regulatory burdens that are being placed on them. I'm sure you're well aware that we have had more consolidation of banks, fewer applications for new banks starting up into our communities, providing the access that you were talking about just a little earlier in regards to liquidity to be able to grow the economy. Because we have, frankly, a tale of two economies in this country. Given your opening statement that was rather glowing on the American economy, as you travel through the 3rd District of Colorado, we're continuing to see in many cases with the real unemployment level, double-digit unemployment, more businesses shutting down than new business startups. And many of those businesses have expressed to me that their challenge is being able to get capital from their local banks. The banks are telling us they're having an inability to be able to make those loans because of expanded regulations. And when you're making the comment that regulatory changes are not a key driver, we'd had testimony come in from Chair Yellen, Vice Chair Honig, acknowledging that there is a problem with rules and regulations and the impact on our financial markets. Do you dispute their comments?
Well, I would like to see the specific comments to respond to rather than just.
Well, they were talking about the
I think we're talking about different things
effect.
when we use the word liquidity. Typically, liquidity is used to talk about matching buyers and sellers in markets for stocks and bonds. I think what you're asking about is a slightly different question, and it's not something we typically refer to as liquidity, but it's what is the availability of lending to small businesses and maybe individuals. We believe that the credit box has gotten narrower in some ways than it needs to be. That's why, for example, FHA last week moved to try and make clear that the credit box for mortgages should be eased some. I think on the small business side, a lot of small businesses before the financial crisis got access to capital by having individuals really tap into their home equity. So it's a different question than what happened.
Yes, my point is in regards to the regulations that we were seeing on a lot of our community banks. Last year, when we sat down and visited, you'd expressed that you hadn't really talked about this in terms of the FSOC. In fact, when we'd reviewed the minutes from 2010 to 2014, it had not been raised once. What is the threshold that has to be passed? What metrics have to be in place to have those conversations take place at your level?
Well, look, I have had conversations with all of the prudential regulators about the need to use the flexibility that they have to not have a one-size-fits-all approach, and I don't believe they have a one-size-fits-all approach, but they need to keep looking at what can they do to provide the kind of proper accommodation to small institutions that don't present the kinds of risks that some of the larger ones do. Are quite small. You know, even the $50 billion threshold that's now in place for, a SIFI is way bigger than your typical community bank. When the people raise questions of institutions of hundreds of billions of dollars, we're not talking about community banks anymore.
But unfortunately, as Chair Yellen, again, Mr. Honig pointed out as well, we are seeing that trickle-down effect of regulations that are impacting those. Is that an important thing for you to be able to address?
Look, I think we have to do two things at the same time. We have to make sure that our system is safe and sound and that we're not exposed to the kind of financial crisis that did so much damage to this country in 2007, 2008. And I think we have to constantly be asking ourselves, are there things that we can do to make it easier for small financial institutions? We're doing both of those.
I guess the point, Mr. Secretary, that our banks are asking, the community banks which did not cause the financial crisis, is when can we expect to be able to see some action rather than talk?
Well, the kinds of things that we've discussed in this hearing room and other hearing rooms, there are areas like the regularity of reviews for small banks where we're open to having conversations. But when we see a piece of legislation that would really repeal major parts of financial reform, that's a place we're not going. So it's a question of, can you have a conversation about the reasonable thing?
Time of the gentleman has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill.